Hello, everybody, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. First, let me apologize for not making my weekly updates and posting other videos. Been a bit preoccupied this week. My wife and I just welcomed our baby on May the 4th, little baby girl, Nora Lynn Espinosa. Anyways, with all that said and done out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into today's subject, which is going to be covering NPCs. Your NPCs are, well, they're going to be a fundamental part of your story because without them, there's no population in your world. When it comes right down to it, putting together good quality NPCs with real character to them will do so much to make your game so much better, especially if you make these characters memorable. Well, how do you go about doing that? Well, it's just a matter of giving it a little bit of thought. Like anything else, like everything else I've been talking about so far, you start off big and then you just kind of go in onto the narrower details. Arguably, the most important NPC that you're going to be running for the entire game, your campaign, well, campaign or one shot adventure, is going to be the antagonist. And you really want to give your antagonist a fair bit of thought. And depending on the type of story that you're telling, well, that's going to really change a lot about how you put together this antagonist. Going back to last episode where I talked about plots and NPCs, if we take the subject of the paladin that I had rambled on a little bit about with that example story, uh, I think for that story he makes a fairly compelling villain. He's not your typical villain, is the big thing. He's a paladin. He's a lawful good alignment, and it presents unique challenges to the players, especially if any of them are lawful good or are a same member of the faith that the paladin belongs to. And the paladin is the primary antagonist at face value, but for the purposes of that particular story, he's not the primary antagonist. The primary antagonist would be the cursed sword, the sword with the demonic presence bound to it, that evil intellect that's slowly been manipulating him and worming him along down towards this darker and darker path, just bit by bit. Now, in and of itself, that sword is not a direct threat to the players. The paladin definitely presents a much more considerable and immediate threat to them, but that sword certainly brings about certain questions that the players should be asking, like where did the sword come from? How did the paladin get a hold of it? How did it end up deceiving the paladin in the first place? Are there other swords like it, or if it came from somebody who started distributing it? And maybe distributed's not quite the right word or turn of phrase to use when it comes to trying to describe how a demonically possessed sword ended up in the hands of such a righteous individual. The important thing here being identifying the real cause of what's going on here, why this devout, holy character is on this path where they're clearly persecuting innocents. And that establishment of the paladin's character is important, to if you really want to contrast just how big of a jump this is, then ideally what you want to try to do is show through repeated interactions that this paladin is truly devout. They make all their prayers. They do little recitals at each execution. They give hymns, sing songs as they wage into what they believe to be a holy war here against this corrupting influence, while never realizing that the corrupting influence is right there in their hands. That helps to establish the story quite a bit better, especially if, as we go along, the players somehow manage to figure out that it's the sword that's corrupting the paladin and has put him down on this really dark and really bloody path. Now, ideally, for this type of a story, with this type of a character and setting, what I would do is set this up to where the best possible ending would be to get the paladin to realize the source of the corruption is his own sword. It, that doesn't mean it's going to be a happy ending by any means. I mean, imagine the shock. You believe you're on this righteous path, you are doing good work, dirty work, but still good work and necessary work in order to safeguard the rest of the innocent citizenry. And it turns out, whoops, you've just been slaughtering dozens of people, and you've been deceived this entire time by one of the very things that you swore to destroy and defend the people against. That's enough to shake anybody to their core, even the most resolute. And you can display that with the character. This could be the turning point where this character, this paladin in this development, turns their life around, redoubles their efforts, and really doubles down and becomes an inspiring figure where they try to atone for all the damage and bloodshed that they caused. Or they could entirely abandon their faith, or they just struggling to deal with the trauma, that realization, that they have done something so awful that has so horribly stained them. They can't get it. They can't wash their hands of the blood. The memories haunt them. The screams, the faces of the dead and the dying as they persecuted them so ruthlessly. It sends them down the path towards becoming a blackguard. Any number of things are possible right there, and all three of those examples that I just gave you make a certain amount of sense. It follows a narrative flow, and it's a sensible amount of character development right there. Now, that's just one example of an antagonist. Really, depending on the type of setting and story that you're playing, you can create limitless different kinds of antagonists there. The important thing is that you tailor them to the story you're going to tell. That's going to be massively important. But there are going to be certain other character types that you're going to be using to populate your world that are going to be, to a certain extent, somewhat universal. For example, every single setting, whether it's Pathfinder, Dungeons and Dragons, Shadowrun, Rollmaster, I could think of numerous others, but you're going to always find that bartender, that barkeep kind of character that the players can kind of come to, maybe not necessarily rely on, but well, think about any good story, like say the Dresden Files, for example. In the Dresden Files, there's always Mac at the bar there, and he's always got his homebrewed beer there, ready and available for Harry anytime he comes in. And the bar is established as being pretty well unique with its layout, the layout with the fans out of order, and the pillars, odd numbers of pillars placed at random locations, inherently designed to help disrupt the magical flow that the bar's typical patrons might try to use when they're drunk and their dander's up. It helps to disrupt things, and it gives the place a certain amount of character and charm all its own, and it tells you a lot about the bartender himself there. This is a character that knows a lot about what the magical world is like, that a lot of the more mundane, ordinary folks don't really know much about or give much thought to. Doing something a little bit like that, just those little details about the character, and more important, or as importantly, the place that they run and that they set in, gives a great amount of detail. Like there's a vast degree of difference where if you were to go with a well put together, warm little pub with well made wooden chairs, soft little cushions, well worn over the years, but nonetheless still comfortable to sit in and relax as there's a crackling fire in the hearth, pardon me. And they serve warm, well cooked, well put together food, and the bartender's short, stout dwarven character, well trimmed beard, orangish colored hair flowing down and braided in with the beard. This is a warm, smiling character, and warm and smiling because he's surrounded by good drink and solid people that tend to pay him more often than not. Definitely a change of somewhat of a change of personality from the slightly more grim and dour and closed off dwarves that you might typically find. This is a dwarf that's gone into business for himself, is running a business catering to a wide degree of characters and people that pass through. And this particular barkeep has had to learn to open up a bit more and be a bit easier to talk to. And right there, that's just again one example of something that you could do. Always, always, always tailor things to the particular setting that you're playing in. For example, if you're playing in Dark Heresy, the Warhammer 40k setting, I mean, the tagline for the game is "In the grim darkness of the year 40,000, there is only war." I mean, it's a grim, grim, grim dark setting, and there's not really a whole lot of ways you can play that the tone of that kind of setting. It's very bleak, and that darkness is just omnipresent in everything for that kind of a setting. Just because, well, you're playing a handful of people in a vast, uncaring, very bloody galaxy where there's conflict rife all over the place from sector to sector, planet to planet. It's uh, it's just a very, very bloody and bleak setting, and therefore the characters populating that setting are going to reflect it. There's going to be that just that little edge of darkness into in just about everything and every aspect of people's lives, and the places where it's where characters populating are not just grim, bleak, and bloody, awful bastards is going to serve as a pretty sharp contrast, and also serve as a setting where there might be just a little bit of corruption settling in. That these people are complacent, they're lazy, they're not as devout in their worship of the God Emperor of mankind. They're not quite so. They're starting, especially the elites of a particular planet or sector, they might be giving in to that little bit of excess, that little bit of corruption, and starting their way down on the path to forming their own Slaneshi cults. It's a lot of little things. It depends just so much on the type of setting that you're playing in. But always remember, little details, a few extra things about characters here and there can do a lot to set them apart and make them more memorable. Um, Again, going back to the example setting that I use, where I was running not a cyberpunk, a steampunk high fantasy setting with my cousins. There's one character that they keep seeing with a little bit of repetition. They see him with some frequency. It's Captain Marcus Benendois from their old unit at the very start of the game, where they're fighting down at the Sigurd Battle Works against the Orcs of Three Tusk Hold. The man had lost his arm and a leg, and he runs a tavern and inn called the Armless Armsman. Now, for his service, he was able to get a magically enchanted wooden prosthetic for his arm and his leg, so he can still walk around and function with just about the same degree of flexibility, fluidity, and strength of an average human man. But he's a man with a graying mustache and beard. He speaks with a bit of an accent, and the place he runs is warm and cheery, if a bit small, but it's well located and situated near the gates of the capital Corvair city. So still sees a good deal of steady business coming through his little spot there. Is he going to be a wealthy man? Maybe not, but he's still going to live comfortably after his service to the Empire. And his old service, being a soldier and a veteran, it links him pretty damn closely with the characters who are now continuing their service in higher roles within the Empire as agents for the Shaded Aegis spy network. So he provides them a safe place to stay. Doesn't matter how full up he gets, he's always going to find room for these characters just because they helped save his ass just a handful of years ago. And again, just that little bit right there, with his arm, leg, mustache, the place that he runs, and his history with the characters, it sets him apart and makes him more memorable from just the teeming masses of NPCs that the characters might run into. And once you've got these little bits of details about the characters down, ideally you've already thought about what kind of roles they're going to play. For example, antagonist or supporting cast or some type of helper or layperson that the characters go to and work with some frequency, or researcher, study buddy, mercenary, hired mage, etc., etc., etc. Once you've kind of got an idea of what their role is going to be, you can decide how much effort you're going to put into putting their stats together. Now, if it's a character that's really never going to see a whole lot of combat, I'd say you don't really need to put too much together. Kind of get an idea what the character's level or however many skill points or karma it is you want to spend on them, so that way you can get some of the key skills that they're going to be relying on figured out. For example, if your characters in Shadowrun are going to a smuggler, they're going to have the smuggler's going to have a higher degree of well, maybe not necessarily, but ideally the character is going to have a higher knowledge of maybe the armorer skill, be a little bit familiar with firearms usage themselves, have some negotiation skills and knowledge of weapons technology in order to help facilitate their abilities at the business that they're trying to run, smuggling guns back and forth through different secured locations and avoiding law enforcement or corporate law enforcement or whatever degrees of people are trying to prevent him from dealing in the firearms that he's trying to get into the hands of Shadowrunners and other illicit figures of the criminal underworld. Now, yeah, so figuring out their role will help you figure out the level of detail you need to throw into things. Going back to the antagonists that you have for your story, that's one character that you're basically going to want to build from the ground up throughout to whatever level or difficulty you need that character to be at. And one thing I would say for boss characters, whatever the setting, don't be afraid to give them a few extra abilities, a few extra little traits in there to make things a little bit more interesting. Myself, definitely a big fan of house ruling things, throwing in my own little rules or twists or abilities onto things just to make things a little bit more unique and interesting. Certainly, it helps to just provide that little bit of extra challenge for the players, and it may not always be strictly by the rules, but as I've said before, story is always going to be king. It's the number one thing to consider. The second thing, which actually the two number one things I would say are going to be, is it good storytelling and is everybody having fun? If it's good storytelling, makes things interesting, and everybody's having fun with it, then screw it. You don't need to run everything specifically by the rules. Just have some ideas in mind on how you want things to function. Like if it's an extra magical ability, maybe make it subject to some of the dispel magic or magic suppression abilities or different bits of gear and trinkets that the characters might have on hand and want to make use of. Like I said, it's supposed to make things interesting, not make things so damn difficult that the players just give up and leave in frustration or leave pissed off. The idea is to have fun, not make anybody mad. And so, house rule, but house rule with just a little bit of care, just that little bit of finesse to make your characters interesting, especially antagonists, and maybe one or two of the, if it's an antagonist that has some lieutenants and supporters helping them. Think something kind of like Thanos from the Avengers Infinity War. He is certainly a terrifying and very powerful force to be reckoned with, but he didn't do everything on his own. He had lieutenants and generals underneath of him that would go out across the stars and help run these various activities for him. He'd send Gamora as an assassin and also out to go hunt down certain items for him, and the same with his other staff that he had with him. They would perform these different tasks, and well, let's just boil it down to, it's hard for one person to do everything. So you have help. Make sure when you design the help for your antagonists that you take a certain amount of care with them as well too. That's definitely another set of characters I'd recommend building from the ground up. and establishing a little bit of story and some key details of those characters. So that way, again, like with everything else I've been talking about so far, you establish them as separate and unique somehow. And remember, always start off bigger and then focus in on the littler details, Focus on the big and broad things like what class is this character going to be? What skills do I want them to have? And what race should the character be? And you just go in further and further and further until you get down to stuff like the skill points and little knickknacks that they might have on hand there. And you should have a fairly well fleshed out character. Now, then, when it comes to figuring out other stuff like underlings, henchmen, thugs, whatever, uh, they're going to be combat oriented, so definitely figure out those little character details there, their stats, their skills, their equipment. But for the most part, you're not going to need to come up with a whole lot of names, extraneous details. You can come up with a few random things on the fly. It's generic enough information that it should just be quick and easy and roll right off the tongue, but you don't need to figure out the entirety of their backstories. That at that point it's just too much work. Um, and don't feel like for other supporting cast characters like you need to figure out everything about them right away. Uh, like I've talked about before, players are dastardly little buggers, and they may go off the beaten path and decide to make friends with a totally random NPC. You didn't even think to give this character any backstory because, hell, why would you? It's just an extra face in the crowd. But sometimes a player, I've done it before when I've been playing, I get that itch and I decide, you know what? That person's going to be my best friend. And well, the DM has had to figure out a little bit of extra detail about that character. And she's like, crap, got to come up with a name. Name is blah, 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 something. They have to throw something out there. And I'm putting myself on the spot right now. But the idea being, you don't have to figure out every detail right away because, well, think about it this way. It's this NPC's first time meeting this particular character. Most people don't open up and immediately start spilling their life story to a stranger they just met. I myself, I find I have an easy time talking to people, but even still, I'm measured with what I share, not because I'm uncomfortable talking to people, but because I don't know what is. I don't know. I'm trying to gauge and figure out what level of detail is oversharing for a person. So you can always play it off this way as though this person is talking to you, but they're not bringing everything out because, well, they just met you. They don't know why you're talking to them. You're this random armed and armored stranger that's just sat down next to them and started blathering away. They're a little bit uncomfortable. They don't know if you're a crazy person or not. Certainly you look like a crazy person, but anyways, that's your out for having all these extraneous details picked up for when your players glom on to a random NPC character or whatever along the way. And it's a way for you to think, okay, let's build a little bit more detail into this character. And you can build it over time too. Like Marcus Benendois, that level of character detail didn't fully come out till after a session or two, actually 2 sessions, because they had to go through the start of the campaign with the battle at the Sigurd Battle Works, and then they had the second session. They met back up with him and they found him at the Armless Armsman. So that's that level of detail and that character progression over time there. So these things will build up, and as these things build up, your players will get to be more familiar and more attached to these characters. One other thing I should mention when it comes to these character details, write them down somewhere. It pays just massive dividends story wise to take some notes and try to keep things together, because if any of your players are halfway decent, or if you have even at least one that's taking down notes and details, you're going to want to make sure that the notes and details match up, because if you describe these cyborg enemies that they fought once or twice before as centaur-like with these cybernetic legs and robotic robotic appendages that propel them forward so that they have the lower halves of a horse and their upper bodies are covered with dermal plating, and then next time around they're described as being more lizard-like in appearance. The lower halves, their appendages are more crocodile-like in appearance in a strange way, or Komodo dragon-like. That change up is going to bring up some questions there. It's just conflicting detail. It does stuff to pull people out, and it just makes you look a little bit less prepared. So write down these details so that you remember them and can bring them out later when you bring these characters back out. And having recurring characters like that just makes the world feel more alive, like it's a living and breathing thing. And it does so much more to just draw your players into this world and into this story. And again, this is just some core basic stuff that will apply regardless of whatever setting that you're playing in. And I really think that this will be massively helpful for you. For any new DM or storyteller, this kind of stuff will go a long ways towards helping you tell better stories for your players. And I think that's about it for now. Thank you very much all for your time. I appreciate you coming down here and spending it with me watching this video. If you liked it, please hit the like and subscribe button and click on that little bell icon so that way you get notified of when I've got new content coming down the pipe for you. I have been your host, your resident storyteller extraordinaire, and your master of lore, Jordan Espinosa. Thank you very much for your time. Have a good night, guys.